Welcome to the Noon Dish. I'm your host, Tommy Ashley. We're sponsored by Johnny T-Shirt, JohnnyT-Shirt.com. That is Don Callahan. That is the expert in the building. Mr. Callahan comes to us from the Man Tower. Don, what's happening today, my friend?
I'm glad that we're going to have a real expert.
I know, really.
Hopefully make me look good.
So if you're looking at the title of this podcast, The Noon Dish, The Recruiting Landscape with Tom Lemming, we felt like we needed to bring somebody in that actually had some gravitas on the subject, because Don has been ignoring me lately. So he went and got somebody, a big timer, to brighten up my day. We'll have Mr. Lemming join us here shortly. But Don, let's get in it. Last week's or 2 weeks ago, chat MVP, who was it?
Jim Holland, who has been in here a while. So if Jim's in here now, congratulations. And then also let me know if you have been chat MVP more than once. I can't think
he has.
I don't think he has, but he's been in there so much. We only have 1 2-time, right? Who's the 2-time? Was it Crowley?
Maybe.
Sean?
I can't keep up.
Sean,
with that.
Sean should know this. Sean's always in. Sean, are you the only 2-time chat MVP? And if not, do you know who is?
It's one of the regulars. Of course, Mark's in here, Preston's in here, Sean's in here. They're all here.
I can't remember who it was.
Our water cooler discussion has become quite familiar with a lot of people. And we wanted to do a top 5 list for later in the show, but I think Don's going to win out here on his choice for top 5. And folks in here that are regulars, mix it up for us sometimes. Shoot us some top 5 ideas, because Don thinks that my top 5s are always
how
things
people
that
piss me off.
But we want to make them a little happy.
For those who know Tommy Ashley, it's so on brand.
That is not accurate. I am the nicest person you will ever meet.
You are a very nice person, but you are always aggravated. You're always ready to fight people.
It is. I'm cold, man. We covered the baseball game last night. Carolina beat Elon.
Mark says Sean is the only 2-time. So Sean, what are you doing, Sean? We're on. I know you're in here because I've seen you.
Sean's right there. He's already there. Yeah.
Smash
that like button.
So he actually started messaging.
I don't understand how that works. You can chat before it starts.
Yeah, I think once you start it all up.
Because that's one thing on the basketball post-game podcast. You come in there and people are already flaming it out.
Yeah, so maybe he got in there, posted some messages, and then he went to sleep. Or maybe got some lunch. But so what is our top 5?
You tell me. You wanted to do comic book characters. I don't read comic books.
I don't either, but at least, I think everybody knows some. You could go from the movies.
We're going to do like Marvel or Avengers or things like that.
Yeah. Top 5.
We can do that. We do top 5. Are we doing Avengers or are we doing DC comics, or does it matter?
Whatever. Comic, it could be DC comics. It could be maybe I read comic books a little bit when I was a kid. I actually, just before I moved, I guess my prior house, I sold all of my old comic books, but they weren't in great shape. But beyond that, I don't even like the movies that much. I've seen some of them. I feel like there's so many of them, and they're such a big deal that you had to have at least seen a couple of them.
Yeah.
Even if you're not big.
I think some of them are cool, but we'll get into it. I put it in the chat, top 5 comic book characters. That can include Avengers, DC Comics, Batman, Spider-Man, all that good stuff. Whatever you like. So hold that for the end and drop them in the chat.
Yes, drop in the chat throughout, right?
Yeah. I just, I got to be able to keep up with that, and to keep up with you, and then a real expert that we'll have here shortly is going to be a challenge. But let's talk about your scoop from earlier today and yesterday that you dropped, sort of an expansive look at North Carolina, the state of North Carolina, the class that is the 2025, 2025 class. Let me ask you a question. How do you determine your tiers? Is it offers? Is it what? And explain your tiers.
It is. So ultimately, the ranking is based off of my evaluations and my conversations with other people, with college coaches, high school coaches, scouts, that sort of thing. This is kind of just my initial kind of thoughts, but then also kind of looking at what is the quote unquote market kind of saying, like if a kid has a gazillion offers, like David Sanders has got to be in that top tier. You know what I mean? And because it's not just you can't just purely go off of offers, because all these kids have 40 offers and then end up choosing. We had a kid from the Tidewater area had a gazillion offers, end up choosing UNC Charlotte. So you can't really go off of offers, but what you can do is kind of get a feel for who's truly recruiting these kids, and so that kind of gives you a feel for what the market is saying too. So there's a little bit of a I guess early on, there's an influence of that to kind of get my mind right for those things. But what ultimately, it just helps me, when you're looking through, I mean, if you're watching film, and a lot of it's a lot of different settings, obviously, you're not doing it just straight, you got to take some breaks. But even so, if you watch a dozen kids, I mean, you're talking about a few hours. So it's difficult to kind of recall, even with your notes, just exactly what you saw when you first started towards the end, or maybe what you were watching, a week prior and all that. So it helps me kind of organize it into tiers. So then I can kind of tackle a tier. And if I feel like, hey, this kid maybe belongs in a different tier, I can kind of do that also. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, well, to a certain extent, because I want to ask you, just so people understand the amount of work that you do on this and then everybody else that's in this game, the recruiting game, how many players in each class, roughly, do you have to evaluate to be able to fully cover?
So, all right. So back when I was doing a top 50, I mean, I was evaluating, watching film, taking notes, all that sort of stuff. It would end up being like 300 something kids, because it's not just the top 50. I'd also have 25 addition to that, which brought me up to 75 of recruits who were honorable mention, because when I initially started, I wanted to give as much attention to as many kids as possible. Because obviously, I mean, David Sanders doesn't need any additional publicity, but some of these other kids on the end of the list. But that just became way too time consuming. So now I only do a top 25, and usually what happens is the top 25 are just guys who end up being Power 5 players. So usually I can give a quick look on a kid, or check his measurables, or whatever it is, and just say, okay, this kid is not, he's not a Power 5 guy, so I can kind of just toss him aside. But there's a lot of kids you look at and you're like, all right, group of 5 guy, but let me keep him on my list to kind of reevaluate over and over again. So we're talking probably about 100-ish,
It's a lot of young men you got to evaluate every year. It was interesting. Jason Staples and I did a scouting report podcast on the transfers.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those transfers was the D3 guy, Zach Greenberg from Muhlenberg Community College, or Muhlenberg College. And I asked him, how do you evaluate somebody? And this goes directly to you as well. How do you evaluate somebody that's just bigger and better than the competition? How do you know if this person's actually good?
Yeah, so I think that's the main question here. And college pro teams have to do the same thing, because even on that level, you're not always going up against elite talent. So I think the way I go about it is you focus on the measurables. Yes, there are always exceptions, but in reality, there is a profile for every position as far as height, weight, length, speed, agility, all those sort of things that really matter. And yes, again, there are guys who defy those, but they have to defy them in other ways. And so, but in general, you focus on the measurables, and then the athleticism, and that's why you're seeing, like, particularly with 247, but also with the NFL draft, there's such a reliance on just how athletic those guys are. They always talk about how they love kids who excel at other sports, because it shows just how transferable those that athleticism is. And then just really, it's so hard, but trying to get a gauge of just what type of player they are, what their mentality is, and their approach. And I think and this is one of the things that Mack Brown has really kind of leaned on heavily recently is, grades. I mean, you had boys who just, well, not just, but they have graduated high school. In reality, if a kid can't get good grades in high school, it's not because of their intelligence, it's because of their work ethic, and so work ethic is really important, because if you're a big guy, obviously you can dominate smaller guys, but once you get to the next level, everybody's big guys. So are you going to do the extra work required to to take that step to be able to beat those bigger guys? But it's such a crapshoot with all of it. And if you really go back, and that was one of the things that we actually did in the prior weekly scoop, you just see just the hit rate is what, I don't know, 50%, 60%, and that's for colleges, and really NFL teams. We talk about draft bust all the time. They spend millions and millions of dollars researching all of these college players and still mess up a good bit of time because it's still such a crapshoot.
So, and you may have it in that scoop, and I'll freely admit I didn't read last week's. I did read this week's, but what is the number one person you missed on, either too high or too low? There's one standout.
Man, I'd have to really look back. The one I was really kind of disappointed in was like Elijah Hood. I mean, I remember being at high school game.
He just kind of flamed out, though.
Yeah, I just envisioned a guy who was going to be, a very high draft pick. And obviously there's some off the field stuff that kind of contributed to him not living up to those expectations. And I felt like he could have done more in North Carolina. I just remember in high school, he was just so incredibly dominant. He was so strong, powerful, and his speed, nobody ever talked about his speed, but he would go to a combine and have one of the fastest times there, and it was just a great kid, from great school, all that sort of stuff. But yeah, I mean, I'd have to go back and look. I mean, I'm sure there's a bunch of them. I feel like what ends up happening is you put these rankings together, and the guys who just kind of fall off, you just forget about them because you're not reminded of them in college. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's easy to kind of move on. And I have so many names in my head that whenever I can push out a bunch of them out of my brain, it's helpful for me to prepare for the next class. So that's kind of part of it too.
So you just freely admit you just forget people. Like if they don't live up to expectations, you just forget them. I mean that sounds like a pretty shitty way to do it.
It might sound weird, but I am actually terrible with names. I'm good with faces. But when I see someone, I'm always like, and you probably have caught on to this, I'm always like, he went to Independence High School. I just can't remember his name because I'll remember the school and everything. But like sometimes after a couple years, or I remember the one time, and this happens actually a lot, but I'll go to a school and I'll be like, yeah, I'm trying to figure out the last time I was here. And you had so-and-so, and they'll be like, no, we had this guy more recently. And I'm like, really? I thought this guy was further back. So there's a little bit of, a jumble in my brain a little bit.
I understand completely. It's only going to get worse. We're going to make it better now, though, because we're going to bring in a guest that you've lined up for us. If I can do this seamlessly, we'll bring in a true expert in the game, the one that Don looks up to, Mr. Tom Lemming. How you doing, Tom?
I'm doing great. How you guys doing?
We are well. I'm going to let Don sort of introduce you and bring you in and get you up to speed here, and I'm going to sit back and watch two recruiting experts discuss this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, Tom is, for those who don't know, I mean, if you've been following recruiting a long time, you know Tom, because way before, I guess, the internet sites came about, the only way you were getting your recruiting information was from Tom's newsletter, his magazine, that sort of stuff. He's on CBS Sports now. The list of things, and I'll let you get into it, Tom. The list of things Tom does now, has been doing, is just, there's no way I can name all of it. But, I mean, I view Tom as basically the father of football recruiting coverage because, and let me just ask you, wasn't it like in the late 70s when you kind of first start doing this?
Yeah, Don, it was, my first trip was the fall of 78 when I went and, because since then, I've tried to go see every top player in the country. That first year I stopped at the Rockies because I ran out of money. So I didn't go out that far past west, but I did see Dan Marino that first year and Eric Dickerson in Sealy, Texas. Wow. And I talked to John Elway. I didn't go out to the West Coast to see him. His dad was head coach at San Jose State at that time. But I did talk to him and his dad, and that was a long time ago. It was 45 years ago. It doesn't seem that long, but
Yeah.
it does. It does when I'm driving. I'm getting ready in about 3 weeks to drive 11,000 miles in 28 days. That's my West Coast trip, which is always a bit of a hazard weather-wise. I do like the scenery, but weather-wise, it could be a problem. Last year, I got caught in a massive snowstorm with 70-mile-an-hour winds in Wyoming, and I figured, hey, maybe this isn't such a good idea.
Yeah. So because as I said, I mean, you were the first to do it. So obviously that idea of covering college football recruiting was not out there. So how did you come up with this, that you were going to cover it and that people were going to actually subscribe to it?
I never went to college after I got out of high school. I ostensibly went to work to get to Western Illinois, where my brother was going. But instead, I traveled around the world. I was in the Kremlin for a few months during communist Russia, went into the pyramids in Egypt. Then I realized around when I was 22, 23 years old that I had nothing to fall back on. So I started working as a stringer for the Southtown Economist on the south side of Chicago. My sister had worked there, got me a job for $5 a night. You go cover a game. And I realized that people didn't care about St. Rita playing Mount Carmel as much as they cared about, are the players going to Michigan or Notre Dame or Ohio State? And then I realized, well, maybe this is something I can do. No one really did a national thing. There was Parade Magazine, which had, I think, 50 players, the top 50 guys in the country, but no write-ups about the players. There was a lot of local stuff in each section of the country. I would go down to Tuscaloosa, where my best friend's family was, and they covered Alabama strictly, nothing else, not even Auburn. And I figured when I do that around the country, I would just travel the nation and see the back then, top 300 players, because, you couldn't get them in groups and it was tough with film. So I just started slowly but surely covering the country, 78, 79. Then when VHS tapes came up, they kind of coincided with me. I started collecting the tapes in boxes, and I would keep them at my house. And throughout the 80s and 90s, everyone came to my house to watch film. Mack Brown told me that he came in 1979 as an assistant at Iowa State to come to my house. But back then, there'd be 10, 11, 12 coaches in the basement with 2 TV monitors and just throwing in tapes, whatever they wanted to watch. Sean Payton, Nick Saban, Urban Meyer. Urban came in 88, he told me. But all the way through, there were always coaches coming by, and I was able to then get a collective opinion of the top players nationally. It really worked out great. Being the only guy, there was a Super Prep magazine, but he had other people writing for him, like myself and other people. But really being the only guy in it from almost throughout the whole 80s and early 90s until internet started coming up in the late 90s. It was great. Now there's hundreds of people in it. I still like it, and I still enjoy the travel, and it's gotten a lot better. I picked up Scholastic Coach Adidas, where I picked it, which is now Gatorade. And then when USA Today came into existence in 1982, I've been picking the team ever since, or up until the last couple of years where they don't really do anything. I got into ESPN back in the 80s, a little bit after Mel Kiper did. I was doing their recruiting for him, and then the last 18 years with CBS. So every now and then I picked up, and I picked the first Under Armour game. I picked the first 12 U.S. Army All-America games, and then the Semper Fi game, and now I'm back doing the U.S. Army game. So as I went along, things fell into my lap.
So let me ask you a question, Tom. It's fascinating to hear you discuss it. First part of the question is, when you started doing this, did you ever imagine what it would turn into now 40 years later, 45 years later? Or did you kind of know this might be something that people are really going to like and I could really do something with this?
I didn't know it's going to get this big, but I did know that, on signing day back in the old days, everyone would announce the day before or signing day or the day after, never like they do now. And it was almost like a holiday all the way up until about 15 years ago when ball players started. Well, we got him. I actually got Chris Leak to be the first guy to announce for the U.S. Army game. And Chris came down to, 5 schools. We had him rush him the last week. Matter of fact, the rule got in place by the NCAA because he was taking private planes to Iowa, Texas, where Mack Brown was, Florida, Florida State. And then the next year, the NCAA said, no more of these private planes for these recruits. He had done it all in 1 week, even though he had already silently committed to Florida. People didn't realize that, and it was I think things like that got really picked up recruiting, but then that kind of hurt all the guys announcing on Sunday. Actually, our first guy was Ron Paulus. I was doing an ESPN show in 1991 with Mike Gottfried, and our number one player in the country was Ron Paulus out of Berwick, Pennsylvania, and he announced live. That was the first guy ever to do it on national TV. It was Dan Debbingham, who was the guy there at ESPN before Chris Fowler, and Mike Gottfried. Now we did a whole 2-hour show just having Ron Paulus announce and then talking about where all the top players go, and that was 33 years ago. So times have certainly changed, and now the ball players are doing it on Twitter individually, which is probably better for them. When we did the Army game, you'd ask them one question, then they say, okay, well, which school is going to be, and the family stood behind them, but it wasn't a whole lot of time like it is now. They all hold their own press conferences, at least the top 300 do.
So,
and those guys have the ability, to your point, to sort of build their own brand and put it all out there and all. Let me ask you, go back to the coaching thing. How did it work with coaches wanting to come to your house? I mean, did Mack Brown or Urban Meyer or Saban say, hey, Tom, I need to come check out the videos? How was that process? Because that seems pretty wild to the normal person looking at recruiting and sort of seeing how the process worked back in the old days.
Yeah, is gradually Vanderbilt was the first guys to do it, because when I started, Lloyd Carr became a good friend of mine, the former head coach at Michigan. Lloyd was at Illinois when I was starting out, and then him and Gary Mulder, they had gotten fired, and they moved back with Bo Schembechler's staff. And Lloyd had told me one story in a meeting. Bo Schembechler said, "Who the hell is this guy in Chicago telling everybody we got 3 quarterbacks coming in?" And Lloyd goes, "Well, Coach, we do have 3 coming." He goes, "Yeah, but we don't want people to know it." Because back then in the recruiting late 70s, everything was announced usually at your spring game. No one knew what was going on in February. It was all quiet, hush, hush. And that was my goal. It was to visit the ball players personally, talk to them on the phone, and try to get them to say what schools they were leaning to and everything else. 1986, CNN flew me down, and I was going to do a 1-hour show with Nick Charles and Dwayne Hickman. And I had 7 hours to kill. So Nick says, "Why don't you predict where the top 10 guys are going?" And I'm not real good at predicting. So I called all 10. 9 of them, including Emmett Smith, told me as long as I wasn't going to say where they're going, they would tell me as I guessed where they're going. Emmett had told me Florida. The only guy who didn't was a guy named Frank Jacobs from Kentucky, who wound up going to Notre Dame, and I guessed Notre Dame. So I got all 10 right, and they thought I was a genius, not realizing that 9 of the guys would tell me where they're going to go. But that was always around signing day. That's why you could always depend on everybody going at that time. But coming to my house, like I said, Mack Brown came as an assistant. Mack also came as a head coach to my house, bringing Tim Brewster, I think his first day on the job as a graduate assistant. And we talked recruiting, but Vanderbilt got the word out there that I had a lot of films at my house. They actually brought 16 millimeter film with projectors that they were showing on my wall in my basement here in Chicago. And after that, the VHS tapes were out there, and they started all picking it up. And gradually, Nick Saban was an assistant coach. Urban was at Ohio State as a graduate assistant at the time when they could travel. Just about everybody, you can mention guys, Sean Payton in the pros, Jim Harbaugh, all of them came by the house to watch film. And I would just sit there, ask a lot of questions. Most of the guys are forthcoming. A lot of, there were some that were kind of, I'd watch them taking notes, and they have their arm around their notes. I said, "Coach, everybody's here. We all know what's going on." But it was fun, and it was great. Joe Morrison, a lot of the guys that were from South Carolina, North Carolina coaches were always coming by the house, probably well before, around the time Mack came when he was at Iowa State. So there were a lot of guys. And again, that's why I think I got better. I would ask them, O-line coaches, what they look for. And I would always take notes, quarterback coaches, what you look for. And so I would pick up on things like that and just take notes and follow along with, the criteria they would use on how they would recruit a ball player. So after 45 years, I've gotten pretty good at least knowing what to look for. But although no one's ever perfect, you're always going to be missing out on some of the players.
So the one thing you mentioned about your travels, how you travel the nation, do these photo shoots, which I have been been at plenty for the past, I don't know how many years. I remember when I first started. Now, I obviously, in addition to going to your photo shoots, I go to the actual high schools in the state of North Carolina. And I can remember, and I think I started in 2008, 2009. And there were a lot of coaches who gave me a lot of pushback. And there were some coaches who wouldn't return my calls, some coaches who would grill me on what I was doing. And there was a lot. I mean, it took actually probably about 5 years before I really wasn't dealing with so much pushback. So I imagine that 20, 30, 40 years ago, you probably dealt with a lot of pushback from, maybe recruits, maybe high school coaches or whatever it would be. What were some of the obstacles that you kind of had to deal with early on with just talking to some of these recruits?
Recruits are always pretty good. I remember seeing Dan Marino. I thought he was a little cocky, and then he worked with us at CBS, and I had brought that up to him. I said, I remember you 40 years ago, you were cocky. And I said, you're still cocky. But most of the other guys, the kids loved the attention because, like I said, I was the only one actually seeing them nationally. So they weren't getting bombarded by a lot of the internet people and people that are going on the top of the players. The coaches were a big hassle because I was 23 when I started. And they didn't like talking to a 23-year-old coming to the school. And back then I went to every school. And a lot of times they weren't available. And, there were no cell phones. I would make my calls on a trip, maybe 100 of them, and have the coach lined up. And then I'd get to the town like Aberdeen, Mississippi, and the coach wasn't available. I didn't, and I'd have to go into one of those pay phones. Kids nowadays don't even know what a pay phone is, but I go into the booth and call and call and call. And I go, hey, I'm all the way down here and you're not available. So the coaches were a lot more difficult. Nowadays, coaches are great with me. The only school I have a problem with is IMG normally. I think I've written some things about how they kind of recruit great players, even though they try to take credit for developing the guys. They bring kids in with 30 to 40 offers already, so they're already well known. So IMG the last 4 years wouldn't even allow me to come by their campus. So they're the only ones nationally. I get along with everybody, and I find it great. I've built up a reputation, so a lot of the coaches know who I am. A lot of the coaches I interviewed in high school, so it's been around. There's guys like Bruce Rollinson, who's still hanging around modern day. He was kind of pushed down, even though he's probably the most famous coach in the country. And he started or almost around the time I did. Bill McGregor at DeMatha, guys that are still in the business with 40 years experience. There aren't many of them left. So now there are a lot younger guys that, like I said, I probably interviewed in high school.
Yeah. And so just to kind of take it, I guess, to modern day, how do you look at like, for example, I know you just came to North Carolina, the state of North Carolina, I guess it was like a month ago. Do you look at it from, each state class by class? Like, do you have a feel for how good this state of the in-state North Carolina recruits are compared to prior North Carolina classes?
Yeah, I could generally tell, but North Carolina is almost always good, much better than South Carolina. That's why whenever I hear South Carolina beat them in your Shrine Bowl, I was, oh, how could that happen? There's maybe 10 good players in South Carolina where there's 40 good ones in North Carolina. So it's like Maryland, two outstanding, and New Jersey, three outstanding states that people don't really give a lot of credit to. And North Carolina is almost always loaded. Some years are better than other years, but every year is good. And that's why I think you could supply Duke and North Carolina State and North Carolina and Wake Forest and East Carolina and with a lot of talent. And then you got everybody else coming in stealing players too. So I think North Carolina is one of the more underrated states nationally. That's why I spent a lot of time in there. And what I normally do is, like our top players, Don and you and I talk about some of the kids early on. I'll call the top 10 to 15 guys before I actually get there. Then I have to call the rest after I get there, which is a hassle because, there's always guys that show up that we don't want there.
Yeah.
And I feel obligated to make sure the kids are included in the magazine because, they come out there and it's a big deal for them. And what I do a lot of, I had written a few years ago that when I drive, right now I'm stopped, but I've got my phone over the steering wheel.
Mm-hmm.
And what I do, a couple of years ago, I was driving from San Antonio to El Paso, which there's absolutely nothing in between except desert. You can go 60 miles without a gas station. So I wrote that. I knocked off 200 films because everybody sends me their Hutto films. And I feel obligated to at least watch them for a couple of minutes or a minute a piece or so. and I'm left-handed, I would be taking notes along here,
Oh,
as long as there's no one alongside me on Interstate 10, because there's hardly anybody out there. My brother, who was one of the heads of the state police, a lieutenant colonel in Illinois, he read that story and he says, if I caught you, I'd arrest you and bring you to jail for watching those films. So I always got to be careful who's around me. I had gotten my last speeding ticket 6 years ago in Wyoming. And I always use this excuse with the policeman that I say, "Oh, officer, I'm sorry, I was trying to pass that truck." He starts laughing. He goes, "You look 10 miles this way and 10 miles behind you." There was no one. I said, "Okay, you got me." Because you can go down Interstate 80 in Wyoming and not see anybody for miles and miles. And same thing from San Antonio to El Paso. Texas is such a wide state, it's 900 miles from Beaumont to El Paso. And a lot of that, you see no one along that, except especially the desert area of West Texas. So I feel comfortable as long as there's no one alongside me taking notes and knocking off some of those films.
You got to do what you got to do sometimes. I mean, well, I don't want to say I've never done anything while driving, but there are plenty. I mean, just about in every situation I have worked, weddings, whatever it may be. I mean, you can ask my family about that. But in the in-state, in the North Carolina guys, not UNC, but North Carolina guys, who are, I guess, maybe some of your favorites from this in-state class?
From this year,
the 2025 class I'm talking about.
Oh, the coming year. I would say, let me see. Throw some names in. I can tell you that because I've seen them all now, except there was one guy, that Thomas Davis, who's 2026. I don't think he was there. And you said he was, but I'm not. I don't remember.
They came at the end. So he was TJ. He came with his two twin cousins, the Harris twins. So I knew you got a photo of them, but they might not have filled out a questionnaire.
I like the 26 guys like Harrison Kendry's one of the great players. I thought was big time. I liked a lot of them. I invited Gus Ritchie to be in the U.S. Army game for this coming year. Really thought he was, and plus, what a personality that kid has. I think he'd be great for having on television.
We've had him on this podcast.
Oh, I thought, isn't he great?
Well, speaking of, so that
he actually committed. He actually committed to North Carolina on this podcast,
and then a week later flipped to NC State.
So, well, you still got several months before you can bring him in there. But I liked the Jadon Blair, that big safety. I was surprised how big he was.
Yeah,
I didn't know he was 6'4". Yeah, and he can run as a safety. I thought he's definitely a 4-star plus guy. I know some people don't have him there, but I'm sure he'll wind up that way when you watch him on film. Covering the guys last year's class, especially down in Charlotte with Jaden Davis and his receivers who were, Jordan Shipp, his dad, Steve, was back in the 90s. I did a show at ESPN, and our last show we always did at Disney World, and we fly the top 25 guys down there. Steve Shipp was one of those guys that came down to Disney World for 3 days. All we do would take us 3 hours to film a 1-hour show, and then the kids got to go on rides for 3 straight days until Disney got cheap and told the kids, okay, one time, because they're taking up too much, because they would always let us. My son at the time was 3, 4, 5 years old. We did it for all throughout the 90s. And we'd go on the rides without waiting, which is a major, major plus, because you go to Disney World, you have to wait an hour for every ride.
Yeah.
And the kids loved it. You had Peyton Manning, Randy Moss, you had Orlando Pace, Tony Gonzalez, all these great players throughout the 90s were down there. And Steve Shipp was one of them. And so I didn't even realize until I saw him. And he said, "Oh, yeah, my dad played." And then we realized it was Steve, a big-time ball player out of Florida. I think they're out of Florida. I'm not sure exactly. Him and his quarterback were 2 big-time guys that year.
Let me ask you about North Carolina's quarterback in that class, in the 25 class. That's Bryce Baker. Obviously, Carolina's had some success with Mack Brown, with Sam Howell, and then Drake May. And then we'll see with the Texas A&M transfer, Max Johnson this year or Connor Harrell. But Baker is a guy, another high-level in-state quarterback that North Carolina's had success with. What's your take on Baker's ability, and what's he going to bring? Obviously, he's got another year in high school, but what do you see from him that puts him up at, a high 4-star level quarterback?
He was one of the guys I called ahead of time because I really liked his film, and I think he's a national guy, and he's a great catch. He was sturdier than I thought he was. He was built pretty good. He had some weight on him. And you watch him, he's got very good arm strength. He's a very good athlete. Always has to be refined with their passing, which is a lot of the high school quarterbacks. But I think he could be a guy that could be a Heisman candidate in 3 years with proper coaching, which I'm sure North Carolina is going to give him. But he was one of the guys I was surprised with. I knew he was a good player, but and watched him on film, but I was surprised at his build. He was a sturdier guy than I thought he would be. So I actually took those kind of notes with him. And some of the guys moved up, like I mentioned, Jadon Blair, guys that were better than I thought they were. That's why a lot of times, and Don will agree, I think, is that you see them in person. You got to see these guys in person.
Yeah.
That's why I try to go nationally, because most kids lie about their size. You know, if they're
Yes.
6'4", they're probably 6'2" and a half.
Yeah.
They always add 10 pounds to themselves. They always exaggerate their 40 time, which you can't really see in person. But you can watch it on film just by how many steps they take for every 5 yards. You can see maybe they're four. Some guys, if they're 4'3", you don't have to even think about it. You could just watch them flying down the field. But kids have a tendency to exaggerate just about everything. And their height is a big thing. And I think that's why it's good to see them in person. But also, I think it's good. Like, we had too big of a group there at Cardinal Gibbons. But I did try to talk to about 10 or 12 of them and their parents just to see how important football is and how much that means to them, because these are great ball players. And I think the last ingredient to be a great ball player is not just great height, great size, great speed, great production, but it's also how much do you really want it? Because once they get to college and they're playing against guys of their own size and their own speed, it really comes down to heart and desire and work ethic to the guys that actually exceed to an extraordinarily level.
So I agree with you on the Bryce Baker, because I remember I went to his school. This was actually before he transferred. I was at Walkertown, met him really quickly in the hallway, talked to him really quickly because he was like a couple weeks away. It had already been decided that he was going to transfer, so it was already an awkward situation standing with his high school coach who was going to lose him. And then I remember it was like maybe a month later, he was coming afar from somewhere at I think it was a camp. I can't remember what it was. And I'm trying to decide who this kid is. And I'm like, well, he has to be a lineman because he was so tall. And then as he's getting closer, I'm like, oh my God, that's Bryce Baker. I mean, he is definitely a well put together kid. The other thing too, if you haven't yet, he's not a basketball recruit, but watch his basketball highlights. I mean, he's so explosive, for a kid who's going to be who is a quarterback and all of that. So explosive on the basketball court, which obviously bodes well for him. Before we let you go, though, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned a little bit about Mack Brown. Obviously, everybody who's listening and watching this now, well aware of Mack Brown, but you've known him for a very long time. What are some of your best Mack Brown stories?
For one thing, I met Bear Bryant and Era Parsegian and Bo Schembech and Woody Hayes, who went to his house in Upper Arlington, talked to him because I have I even met Jim Crawley of the Four Horsemen of Notre Dame and Bronco Nagurski of Minnesota and Red Grange, who's from Chicago, the Wheaton area. Maybe the nicest and the most personable head coach I've ever met is Mack Brown. And he's not a phony, which a lot of the guys are. And I don't want to mention their name, but believe me, in any walk of life, there's phonies in anything. But Mack is one of those wonderful guys. I remember once we were filming with him in Austin, Texas, and my camera crew came down and we're talking to Mack thinks of everything in recruiting. So we get in the elevator and I smell roses. I go, what the heck is this? And then we get to the locker room and I smell roses. I said, Coach, what the heck is all this going on? He goes, Tom, some of the mothers complained about locker rooms smelling too bad and the elevator smelling too bad. So we have a spray that comes out like every 10 seconds, like a spray of rose, like a rose smell that goes in the elevator in the locker room. I'm thinking, wow, this guy thinks of everything. No wonder he had such great recruiting at Texas and at North Carolina, wherever he's been. He is one, I did a I did a Mount Rushmore of my 6 favorite coaches. So I had 6 on a couple of years ago on my TV show, and Mack was one of them, along with the best recruiters over the past 6 years. It was Nick Saban, Urban Meyer, Pete Carroll, Phil Fulmer, and Mack Brown. And Bobby Bowden was the other one. And he's definitely on that Mount Rushmore of great recruiters. And personality-wise, of all those guys, he has to be the best too. So I think the parents of the kids, they understand a phony when they see him and our guy that's trying to tell a joke that he's not a good joke teller, this and that. Mm-hmm. Mack is just a natural when it comes to recruiting. One of the best I've ever seen when it comes to being just a natural. Nick Saban's probably the hardest working recruiter I've ever seen, But Nick has always been so serious. I sat in once when he was at LSU, and he had this guy who's a recruit sitting around who's I think he wound up going basketball, big baby. But we're sitting there. Nick starts telling a joke. I got it, and it was all right. I laughed. The kid just stared straight at him. He didn't get the joke. Nick didn't tell the joke well, and but he was trying real hard. Nick was just really good at all that stuff. And Mack is a natural at recruiting, and the best I've seen over the years.
Wanted to let you go. It's been fun to hear the stories. Let me ask you one last question, and I don't know if this is an easy one or a hard one, but the number one best player you ever evaluated in your 45 years?
That's an easy one. I've said it before. Randy Moss. I was watching. I was with the Pitt coaching staff when Randy was a sophomore in Charleston, and I'm watching the kids, and one of the coaches goes, "Hey, you're watching all these Western PA kids. The best player around here is." And down in West Virginia, a kid named Randy Moss. So my son was with me, and at the time he was 3 or 4 years old. We got in my car and I drove the 3 hours to Charleston, and I went over to Belle DuPont High School, and I asked the coach because I had called him while I was up in Pittsburgh. He said, "Yeah, come on down." And we went down there. I saw Randy as a sophomore, and like I said, I've been picking the USA Today team since '82. So I told the writer, Dave Kreider, I said, "I just saw the best player in the country, and he's only a sophomore." The very next day, we had the biggest paper in the country. The best player I've seen is sophomore Randy Moss, 6'4", 190, out of Belle DuPont, a suburb of Charleston. And it hit like crazy because no one knew about him except West Virginia, Pitt. No one really recruited sophomores back in whenever that was, 92, when he was a sophomore.
I think you muted yourself.
Yeah, I think you're muted. I think you muted yourself, Tom.
Yeah, he's muted us and muted. Oh, well. He's telling a great Randy Moss story.
Yeah. Live television.
Yeah. Text him and tell him he muted himself. I pulled him off.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, it's great stories there. We'll let's see if I can bring him back.
Oh.
I think you muted yourself, Mr. Lemming.
Yeah, we can't hear you.
Oh, well.
All right, we're
just text him and tell him we dropped him out. It's fascinating, Don, to hear the stories not only about Mack Brown or Randy Moss, but just the stories of the trail that you see there for the last 40, 45 years. I mean, it's a little bit different for you, right? You just get people to send you stuff digitally.
Yeah, from the videos. I mean, you don't even have to do that. I mean, just about, like, really, it's the hit rate's like 99% of the time. You put a kid's name in Google, and their huddle account's going to pull up. They most likely have highlights up there. If they don't, they at least have some of the just clips from like a dozen other games or whatever, and you can kind of go through those. So yeah, it's much easier now. I can remember. I do remember the last school to give me a VHS, though.
Who is that?
Travis Bond, his coach in Bertie County High School. Which, have you ever been to Bertie County?
I mean, there's not a whole lot in Bertie County, is there?
No, you go up there and it's there is it's a tough area up there. But that was the last one that gave me the VHS. So from that standpoint,
did you still have a tape player? Did you? Because
I still have. I actually have right now, and I'm debating on. I have one of those dual, the VHS, DVD, and they copy and all this sort of stuff. And I have it actually sitting out over here because I pulled it out when I was doing some organizing, and I'm like, should I get rid of this? Should I try to sell it? I think I can actually sell it. I went and looked on eBay, and I could probably get like $180 for it. But so I'm thinking about that. I haven't had to use it in a long, long, long time. because you don't even use DVDs. You know.
Can I bring you all my? I've got like in my closet right over here. I've got boxes and boxes of VHS tapes of Carolina games, of birthday parties, of everything you can imagine. Can I get you to burn them all to DVD?
We can. Well, I will let you come to my house, and you can do all the burning. We can watch some sports or whatever, but or you're welcome to borrow it for a little bit.
So Tar Heels for Life in the chat said Lemming entered the transfer portal.
Yeah.
It's live television, folks.
Yeah.
Virtually live television stuff.
Yeah,
happens,
it was because he was still talking, and what do we do? You know what I mean? It was kind of like a what do we do sort of situation. But
yeah. But anyway, let's get back focused. We got a top 5 coming up in just a minute. Top 5 comic book characters. Don, anything from your weekly scoops without sharing your scoops that you can share for us? One thing I found interesting is that your quote unquote national recruit list doubled in size.
Mm-hmm.
Your high power, I guess, in doubling the national recruits, the high power 5 list suffered. Is that fair?
Yeah. Well, it's always so hard to, because I mean, really, a lot of those guys are being recruited. I mean, that's probably a small group anyway, if you think about it, who kind of fits into that category anyway, you know?
So let me ask you the hard question, and this is Inside Carolina's Noon Dish and Inside Carolina Recruiting. Why is Bryce Baker not a national recruit? Lemming said he probably should be.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. I think I would like to see. I don't want to, even though I'm going to have natural biases. I try to be as subjective as possible, or as objective as possible. And it's obviously it's difficult. So I do try to be a little bit harder when it comes to the UNC commits. And I think even though people might I don't think I would get too much pushback on it. But if you do get irritated with me for that, just understand that that's, I think, for the benefit. And so what I would like, I guess, is maybe to see him in some of the upcoming showcase camps for quarterbacks, particularly the Elite 11. If he can't make that, I haven't even talked to him about what he plans on doing these things. But I know that, he went to the National Combine in San Antonio in early January. So I imagine it's on his radar, and the basketball season should be over by then, to go to either Elite 11 or the Under Armour camp in Charlotte, to where he can kind of get in those situations and see how he does, how he fares against, quarterbacks like that. Because one of the things he doesn't do 7-on-7, like a lot of these other guys do, because mostly I assume it's because of basketball. But I'm a huge fan of his, and really, I mean, I'm not trying to say he's going to be as good as, but I mean, there's a lot of parallels with him and Drake May, to be honest. Both of them were smart quarterbacks, good frames, sneaky athleticism, great basketball players in high school. Drake was a great basketball player, for obvious reasons. I'm sure playing against his brothers kind of helped that a lot. But Bryce is the same sort of way, and so I kind of feel like, I'm not projecting Bryce to be like a first-round draft pick or anything like that. I don't want to put that on him, but very similar to that. But yeah, it's just me being careful, me wanting to see a little bit more. I guess I would rather bump someone up than drop them. So just want to see a little bit more this offseason from that stuff, and also see how it goes for this season. He definitely passed all of the tests, I feel, in my eyes at least, during his junior season, playing in a new school, playing against better competition, that sort of thing.
So I guess the question maybe that what would separate Drake, if this is fair, is Baker as big a competitor as Drake was or is? Because it'd be hard to be
yeah. And even their temperaments are so similar too. Because off the field, Drake was just, that all shucks, oh yes sir, no sir, oh man, I just try to, and that's how Bryce is. Bryce is he's a different personality, but definitely, has that same sort of temperament as far as like being kind of easygoing off the field sort of thing. But yeah, as far as I mean, that's the other thing. I want to see that a little bit more. The thing that always stood out to me with Drake was just his vision and how he just saw things within the defense and where to go and just how effortlessly he made decisions and all of that. Obviously would like to see that with Bryce also.
Be fun to watch. He's got another year. It's crazy. We're talking 2025 guys, and it's just 2024. North Carolina's recruiting class. Keep up with it with Don Callahan on Inside Carolina Premium. A couple things I haven't done is I haven't talked about Johnny T-Shirt yet. JohnnyT-shirt.com, sponsors of the podcast. Great place to get all your Carolina gear, especially the baseball jerseys are on fire now. Nike's got 4 different ones. Johnny T-Shirt's got them all. But you can get anything related to Carolina at JohnnyT-shirt.com. And congruityhr.com/Tar Heels for a small to mid-sized business. You go to them, you ask them what they can do to help you. They tell you what they can do to help you for free. And if you like it, great. If you don't use it. But if you listen to them, perhaps you can be a national business like they've been able to do. You can be the Don Callahan that rules the area. They can get you to the Tom Lemming status and do the national stuff. And that's always the goal, is to go big, go national. Just like we're talking about Bryce Baker being a national recruit, Congruity can help you get your small business, mid-sized business to be that national brand. Don, are we going to do top 5?
Yeah. Do we have anything else we want to?
Anything else you want to hit on here? I thought Lemming was excellent. Hate we lost him on the Randy Moss discussion.
Yeah.
Randy Moss.
Well, that's the one thing. So I've known Tom for a while now, and I've had dinner with him, and just the stories. Like, we could probably go forever. The stories, and as you saw, he goes into one story and kind of leads into another, and it's so cool. Just, I mean, he's dealt with Dan Marino when he was a freaking in high school, which just blows my mind, and basically anyone who's played in the NFL, or most of the people who've played in the NFL the past 30 years, Tom Lemming has interviewed when they were in high school, which is it's absolutely mind blowing to think about, which is kind of cool. He's talking about Eric Dickerson, Hall of Fame guys. It's crazy.
Yeah. And it's always cool to listen to people. One of my favorite things, and I'm getting older now, but to listen to older people tell stories about stuff they've done, and especially it's cool in this realm, in the sporting realm. And Mr. Lemming certainly has been all over everywhere for a long, long time, driving all over the country, getting tapes, and having all the coaches come to your house to watch tapes on recruits. That's one thing I thought that was really good, Don, and this is something that I'm sure you do as well. He gleaned what to look for and how to rate these recruits at all the positions based on what college coaches needed and wanted out of them. I thought that was a fascinating, because I see a dude that's like 6'5", 240. I'm like, a dude's a stud. I mean, he might not be able to play a lick, but I'm gonna think that look, it's ridiculous. And then he's gotten it from absolutely talking to the guys that have done it at the highest level, recruited and coached. So that was fascinating. Let's talk about top 5.
Yeah.
Your phone's blowing up. So
yeah,
it's
it's
probably
Tom.
time for you what do you say? It messed up?
No, you just said give him a call. So,
right.
Yeah, let's go top 5.
All right, top 5. Yancey Collins, top 5. Marvel, Avenger, DC Comics, any comic book characters: Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, Hulk, Captain America, in that order. Preston always has jokes, but I do agree with one on the list: Deadpool, the Joker, the Raccoon from Guardians of the Galaxy, the Tick, and Ross's grandpa. Paul Hornbuckle, Batman, Pennyworth, Jim Gordon, Joker, Scarecrow, Sean Crawley, Hulk, Spider-Man, Superman, Captain America, Iceman. Is that Arnold Schwarzenegger's Iceman? Wasn't he that? In like
didn't he one of
2 or something?
Yeah, I think so.
And top comic book characters: Thundar the Barbarian. I'm not sure who that is, if that's some inside joke. Anyway, I'm going to let you do yours. What's yours, Don?
All right. So, I kind of wrote names, scribbled names out and all that. So my number 5, Punisher. And I don't know, I just liked him. One of the things that got me into comic books was I had found a I don't know if it was a box or bag or whatever in the schoolyard of Marvel cards. And so in the first series, so I actually ended up completing that series. It's one of the things I sold a long time ago. But anyway, and so that kind of got me into cards. But for whatever reason, I like the Punisher card. That in the Ghost Rider. Ghost Rider was the one that was really, it was a rookie card, if that can ever be a thing, but it was a rookie card. And so that one was probably the most expensive one. And I can remember buying it for $1.50 at the local card store around the corner from my house. But anyway, that's number 5. Deadpool. That's mostly because of the movies are great. You know, what's his name?
I was hoping you wouldn't say that. I just think it's stupid.
I like the humor, the goofiness and all that sort of stuff. So I don't know if I've ever seen a Deadpool comic or ever opened one, I guess I should say. Number 3, Joker, especially like when you're considering the movies. And what was I guess it was just called Joker.
That movie is deep.
Yes, definitely not something I would recommend for children, but good movie, I thought.
I thought it was extremely, extremely deep, and I don't know if depressing's the word. Maybe it's the word for it, but I love that movie. I love Heath Ledger's Joker.
Batman.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a shame he's not with us anymore to reprise that. But yeah, I've always liked the Joker in whatever form he was in.
And then my number 2 is Gambit, because that was like at the first comic book that I had where it was a first appearance. And so that was probably the most expensive comic book that I owned. And I ended up getting it. Like, I think my mom bought me like one of those where you can, the grab bags, you buy like 25 of them, you bring them home, you have no idea what they are, you open them up, and one of them was Gambit's first edition. And the number 1, Wolverine. I always liked Wolverine. Thought it was cool with the nails or whatever, the claws or whatever it is, and the you know, how he could he was indestructible or whatever. I never really watched the movies, but I heard he died in one, which I thought was kind of weird because I thought he couldn't die, but whatever. Who's your top 5?
All right, Batman's on the list. I don't know if these are in order because I think Joker would be my number 1. Just because I love that. And somebody mentioned Scarecrow too. Scarecrow in the video game, the first Arkham Asylum video game, is epic. I always liked Hulk. We had. Do you remember Stretch Armstrong and those toys? This before your time probably, but we had.
I do remember Stretch Armstrong.
They were like maybe 1.5 feet tall, and you could stretch them a million ways. And if you ever busted them, it was like some purple goo or something in there. But we had a Hulk version that was cool. So I like. I always like if we go to like a Star Wars character, which is not necessarily comic books, but like Boba Fett. I always like Boba Fett. And you see Mandalorian Svechnikov behind me there on my table, but those type, and you mentioned Ghost Rider too. I didn't really consider Ghost Rider as a comic book character, but I kind of like that movie.
Is that the Nicolas Cage movie?
Yeah.
I don't like Nicolas Cage, so I don't watch his movies.
Care for him, but I like the Flaming Skull and all that stuff. I'm obviously, I'm kind of into that stuff, but And as far as the Avengers and all those things, somebody mentioned Guardians of the Galaxy. Man, the raccoon in the last one tore me to pieces. That was a struggle. Can't watch that movie anymore. Dude, I cried watching Guardians.
I have no idea what you're talking about because I've never watched any of those.
You need to watch those.
Okay.
Anyway, it's I'd probably say Batman's number 1, but it's the first Batman.
Okay.
The Dark Knight, that one. So.
Wait, the first one isn't the first one with Michael Keaton?
Yeah, but I'm not talking about that one. I'm talking about
the second first
Knight.
one.
Yeah. Or maybe the third or fourth.
Yeah, well, yeah, because I think, who knows? Because there's been so many, and they keep on resetting and changing the origin like slightly.
I've never been a fan of like Captain America and Superman, and Spider-Man. I never really liked them, but a lot of cool stuff. I was never a comic book person, but
yeah, not so much either. But it is what it is.
Superman, Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, Mickey Mouse, Sky King. From Steve Blakely. Anything left, Don? Let's get out of here. We're almost under an hour. We're 6 seconds over it. Closing thoughts on Noon Dish. I guess we'll be back in 2 weeks.
Yeah, back in 2 weeks, and I think that would be the dead period will have ended. So we'll have hopefully a little bit more to talk about. I know it's been kind of dry the last couple weeks, but
you can tell us about your call with Tom Lemming.
Okay.
And you can tell stories next week or 2 weeks from now. But that'll do it for this edition of Noon Dish. Like I said, Johnny T-shirt, JohnnyT-shirt.com, Congruity logo right here on the screen. Check them out. Do everything you can to support our sponsors. They're what help us bring this to you. For Don Callahan, I'm Tommy Ashley. And for Inside Carolina fans, thank you for joining us. We'll be back in 2 weeks.